Hello, good evening, everybody. I'm David Harborne, and I'm chair of the Yorkshire Philosophical Society. Thank you very much for those of you who are joining this Zoom lecture live. And for those who are watching the recording, I hope you enjoy it. We're going to hear today from Rob Baldwin, MA, FSA, who studied archaeology of Northwest Europe from the Iron Age to the Anglo-Saxon period at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, which is also where he met his wife, Diana. He then trained as an accountant and worked at both KPMG and WP Thompson. In retirement, Rob has gone back to his first love, taking part in a number of archaeological digs, including some he'll be talking about tonight, and another that was off the North Kent coast, where work was actually only possible at low tide. He's chair of the Lyminge Historical Society and a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. Just happens that Rob and Diana are also friends and close neighbours of my sister Liz, who also lives in Lyminge. Now that means I've been able to see the results of the archaeological dig at St Ethelburga's church that Rob is going to be talking about, and in which he played such a very important part. And I was delighted when Rob offered to talk about Ethelburga, because of course she is someone who is quite familiar to those of us who live in Yorkshire, but perhaps you don't know quite as much about the Kent connection. And certainly I don't think anyone knows quite as much as Rob does. So thank you very much indeed for doing the talk, Rob. And I'm now going to mute myself and hand over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, David, for that introduction. And thank you to the Yorkshire Philosophical Society for the invitation to talk to you this evening. Now, as David intimated, and I'm very well aware, in presenting on Queen Ethelburga to members of a society based in York, I'm addressing the life of someone who's very much part of your local consciousness. Now, I'm sure that many, and maybe most of you, are aware of the local school that bears her name, and many too will have seen her statue in York Minster. Here she is, beside her priestly confessor Paulinus, who was the first Bishop of York and later Bishop of Rochester in Kent. But the story I'm going to tell you is going to put Ethelburga into the context of her time. We'll show you what we know about her, and particularly about what she achieved in the last phase of her life that she spent in the village of Lyminge on the North Downs of East Kent. And this is the village where I came to live 35 years ago, thinking there might be some interesting archaeology in the neighbourhood. I'll leave it to you to decide if I was right. Now, first of all, let's set the scene. What do you actually know about the period that falls between the end of Roman rule in Britain and the Norman conquest? Well, I think it's a fair bet that you'll remember King Alfred burnt the cakes. And here's the illustration from the Ladybird book of King Alfred. And I have to confess that when I arrived at university, a few decades ago now, to study this period, my knowledge did not extend much beyond what contained in this book. It's extended a bit since then, of course. And I guess it's probably one other thing that most people know about the period, and that is that King Harold was killed at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Though whether that was from an arrow in the eye, or whether he was ridden down by a Norman knight, or both, as may be shown here on the Bayeux tapestry, is still much debated. But apart from these events, for many people, we're dealing with a dark age, about which they know very little. So let's look at a timeline. This line represents 2,000 years of British history, and each of the coloured blocks stands for 200 years. So the Battle of Hastings is more or less in the middle here. The current parish church in Lyminge dates to shortly after the Battle of Hastings. And we know this because we've had the mortar in the chancel scientifically dated. So coming back to the timeline, King Alfred is roughly 200 years before the Battle of Hastings. The two orange blocks here represent the roughly 400 years when Britain was under the direct rule of the Romans. But for the purposes of this talk, we're mostly looking at the period prior to the Battle of Hastings, which is shaded purple. This is commonly known today as the early medieval period. Now, people have been living in Lyminge for the past 10,000 years, but continuous settlement started in the late 400s. This was a couple of generations or so after the end of direct Roman rule, when we know that people of Germanic or even Scandinavian descent began to come here. Now, the next key date for us is just over a century later, 597. And this is when St. Augustine arrived with his Christian mission from Rome. This was not the first time Christianity arrived in the British Isles. Indeed, it first arrived during the early years of the Roman occupation and was still practiced in many places and spread to new locations after the Romans left, surviving particularly in the west of Britain and in Ireland. But the significance of St. Augustine is that he was coming from Rome at the invitation of Ethelbert, the pagan king of Kent. Ethelbert was reaching out to Rome to embrace the culture of continental Europe, seeking to link his kingdom to the continental social and political mainstream in a way it had not been linked for almost 200 years since the end of Roman rule. We think Queen Ethelburga came to Lyminge around 634. Now, Ethelburg is the name by which she was known at that time. Ethelburga is the Latinized form of her name, and that's what I'm going to call her for the rest of this talk, because apart from anything else, it's a lot easier to say. So looking at the timeline, what you can see is that Ethelburga was in Lyminge about as long before the Battle of Hastings as the Spanish Armada is to us today. And I hope this gives you some perspective on the length of the period we're looking at. Now, some of you may be wondering why I've not yet used the term Anglo-Saxon. So perhaps I should explain. Unfortunately, in recent years, this has become quite a politically charged term because of white supremacists appropriating it in the USA in particular. So in that respect, it's a problematic term that's not easy to use in a neutral way. But perhaps more importantly, it's not a name that was contemporary with Ethelburga's own time. It didn't actually exist then. No one called themselves Anglo-Saxons at that time or thought of themselves as Anglo-Saxons. It's a name invented at the court of Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, getting on for 200 years later, to distinguish the Saxons living in continental Europe, recently conquered by Charlemagne, from the English Saxons living across the Channel. So Anglo-Saxon describes a political grouping of a later time period, and it's not very helpful to use it when talking about the period when Ethelburga was alive. In her lifetime, there were many kingdoms and political groups in the British Isles. In Ethelburga's time, the island of Great Britain was divided up into many kingdoms with a range of names. Marked in red on this map are the kingdoms founded by Germanic invaders that existed at this date. So we're looking at around 630. These are what were left after many earlier smaller kingdoms had consolidated. And obviously there was more consolidation later on to eventually create the Kingdom of England in the early 900s under King Athelstan. But what is important for us now is that in the early 7th century, what we now call England then comprised a mosaic of small kingdoms. Now, amongst the English-speaking kingdoms, there appears to have been some political mechanism by which, at any particular time, the king of one kingdom was recognised as a paramount king. The term sometimes used is Bretwalda. At the time Augustine arrived in 597, at the end of the 6th century, this was Ethelburga's father, Ethelbert. He ruled an area that had been known as Kent since before the Romans arrived. We don't know how he thought of himself. His successors called themselves kings of the Kentish people. But Pope Gregory called Ethelbert by the Latin term Rex Anglorum, which means king of the English. And that suggests that even in the 6th century, an overall English identity, perhaps related to the language they spoke, was beginning to form in the kingdoms founded by the Germanic invaders. This seems to be so, whatever the origin of the people who lived within those kingdoms. DNA analysis of burials from the period indicates that only a proportion of the population across England were immigrants. But an identity of Englishness applied to the population as a whole began to be perceived by people like Pope Gregory, looking at the British Isles from outside. Now here we see where Ethelburga sits within the royal family of Kent. We don't know precisely when she was born, but it was probably no earlier than 605. She married in 625 and can hardly have been more than 20 at that time, and probably was younger. Her significance to the north of England is that she was given in marriage to Edwin, the pagan king of Northumbria and the new paramount king at that time. Ethelburga's father, Ethelbert, had died around 616 and had been succeeded as paramount by King Redwald of East Anglia, usually thought to be the man buried in the Sutton Hoo ship burial. Redwald himself died around 624, so Edwin became the new power in the land. The King of Kent at this time was Eadbald, Ethelburga's brother. It seems that Eadbald was seeking a political alliance with Edwin and hoped to leverage the power of the new religion, Christianity. So Eadbald brokered a political deal with Edwin, the new paramount king. Essentially, Eadbald used marriage to his own sister to gain an alliance with Edwin. And a crucial part of this was that the marriage was agreed on the understanding that Edwin would convert to Christianity. This he duly did, baptised in a new church constructed on the site of York Minster at Easter 627. According to the Venerable Bede, who I'm sure many of you know was living in Jarrow in Northumbria about a century later, this ushered in a first brief Northumbrian golden age. Edwin's estate at Yevering near Wooler in Northumberland, excavated by Brian Hope Taylor back in the 1950s and 1960s, features in the story of this period. Yevering is located in the valley of the River Glen, which, I understand, is the model for Greendale, home of Postman Pat. But that, as they say, is another story, quite literally. Now, Edwin's Christian reign was cut short in 633, when he was defeated in battle at Hatfield Chase near Doncaster, killed fighting the pagan king Penda of Mercia, who was allied to the Christian king Cadwallon of Gwynedd. And this was not a religious conflict about Christianity versus paganism. This was a battle about political power. And the result was that it made the north a dangerous place for Ethelburga and her family. So the widowed Ethelburga, with her children and Bishop Paulinus, fled back to Kent, seeking refuge with her brother King Eadbald. And it is recorded in the collection of accounts known as the Kentish Royal Legend, the earliest of which dates to about a century after Ethelburga, that Eadbald gave Ethelburga his estate at Lyminge. This is almost certainly where she came to live. This is the centre of a great estate of the mid-6th to the mid-7th centuries, marked by a grouping of large timber-framed feast. These were standing in Ethelburga's lifetime and were discovered and excavated beginning in 2012. This is what you can see in the lower image. This is the excavation. You can see the outline of one of the halls here. There's another one over here. And up here is a conjectural reconstruction of what Ethelburga may have known. They're clearly buildings of great prestige and demonstrate the lavish lifestyle of the people who lived in them. The floor of one of these halls even had a concrete floor, made using crushed Roman brick using the Roman building technique known as opus signinum. This underlines the high status of these structures and the international reach of whoever built them, since that person could import building technology from continental Europe. Now, coming back to look at the site here, this dark stain is a midden, and the patterning in it is the sampling that's going on. It's archaeological sampling with the trench going across the middle of it. Only 1/10 of this midden was sampled, but it revealed the largest collection of vessel glass from any early medieval site in the country. We've got sherds of vessel glass here. This complete vessel, which is the kind of vessel that was being smashed, actually comes from a grave in Lyminge, which is why it's intact and wasn't smashed. Fine glass drinking vessels and no doubt wine were being imported from the Rhineland, and these vessels were being smashed in prodigious quantities. Now, on the opening slide of the talk, you may have noticed this grand piece of jewellery. This is the Kingston brooch, found in a grave about 8 miles north of Lyminge. It's now in the World Museum in Liverpool. This doesn't just illustrate the kind of bling that might have been worn in the feasting halls at Lyminge. It comes from Kingston, remember, the king's settlement, and is close enough to Lyminge that it could actually have been worn there when the king was in residence. So this is the kind of thing that they'd have been wearing. Imagine the magnificence, the colour, the splendour of what was going on in those feasting halls. A lot of early medieval archaeology has been found in Lyminge. This map gives an impression of the extent of discoveries, starting with a couple of cemeteries. We've got one here near Bridge Farm. We've got another one up here off the Canterbury Road. Both of these date probably to the late 5th century, a couple of generations after the end of Roman rule. There's roughly contemporary occupation here at the end of Rectory Lane. We've got the Royal Estate Centre here, which you saw in the aerial photograph. This is on Tain Field, dating to the mid-6th to the mid-7th century, and that's where Ethelburga probably lived. And then we have over here, west of the church, late 7th to 9th century monastic occupation. And all of this was known by 2015. But the reason anyone was even looking for early medieval archaeology in Lyminge is down to this man, Canon Robert Charles Jenkins, rector of Lyminge from 1854 until his death in 1896. Jenkins was an antiquarian, a founder member of the Kent Archaeological Society in 1857, when archaeology was still in its infancy. We don't know if he bought the living at Lyminge thinking he would look for antiquities, or whether that idea came to him after he arrived. But within 5 years of coming to Lyminge, he had uncovered this. Now, this is what put Lyminge on the map: the masonry remains of apparently a very early church. Jenkins immediately went into print, identifying these as the remains of Queen Ethelburga's church, and he was so proud of them that he left them on display. The path to the church, you can see here at this stage, it's just a mound of earth. This had to be tidied up later on, so people could actually still get into the church The entrance is here through this porch. And this is what it looked like up until around 1929-1930. The grills were installed by Jenkins on the pathway so you could look through them and see the walls underneath. But in 1929, the church wardens decided that frost was causing so much damage that it was better to rebury the remains to remove the ongoing problem of maintenance. So for the next 90 years, all we had in order to understand what Jenkins had found were these pictures that you've just seen and his plans and what he wrote about them. Now this shows a drawing from Jenkins' notebook, essentially a fairly simple structure, quite fragmentary, with a curved or apsidal east end. You can see how these dotted lines indicate he was already thinking how this might have been reconstructed as a complete building. So this is the way his thinking is going. But what Jenkins eventually published was this. Now, I hope you can see that there are solid lines. So you've got solid lines here, and you can recognise that he did find these because they're marked in his notebook, and there's a bit over here as well. So that's what he actually found. But then there are many more lines that are not filled in. And these represent walls that he conjectured, or as you can see here, foundations destroyed. So he was conjecturing that there were actual walls there and they'd been robbed out. He imagined a lot, and it was a lot more than he actually found. The earliest written document referring to Lyminge is a charter dating to the late 7th or early 8th centuries. It mentions the Basilica of the Blessed Mary, Mother of God, located in the place called Lyminge. The use of the term basilica rather than, say, ecclesia, which is the Latin for church, is unusual. And this led Jenkins to think that the word basilica was used deliberately, and that he'd found at Lyminge a grand three-aisled basilican church on continental Italian lines. And here you are, you've got the three aisles that he was thinking of. This is essentially what he's drawn. Now this was extremely problematic, because if this is what Jenkins had found, it was unique in the British Isles. And scholars found it difficult to take this idea seriously. And so Lyminge became an odd footnote in the architectural history of the period. Nobody could say for sure what was there, but no one could check because it had been buried. In order to explore what Jenkins discovered, it would be necessary to dig up the path. And this would be extremely expensive, increasing the cost of any excavation project substantially. So for many years, reappraising Jenkins' findings seemed to be an impossible dream. But then, with all the interest generated from the other excavations around Lyminge that I've already mentioned, there was a head of steam to look at the remains in the churchyard again. So in 2018, we launched what ended up being a £300,000 project, part funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And in 2019, we were ready to break ground. Dr. Gabor Thomas, Associate Professor in Archaeology at the University of Reading, who had led the previous excavations up to 2015, gave his time to the project for free and brought archaeology students from the university to help with the dig. We were given permission to excavate anywhere under a path, but not to disturb any area of known burials. And this is what we found. You can see that the east end of the building is curved, creating what is known as an apse. The sides of the nave are stepped out to each side, so you can see the nave is slightly wider than the apse itself. And there are two column bases across the junction between the apse and the nave. And these would have supported an arcade. The nave extended further westward, but the south wall of the nave went under an existing area of burials and we couldn't excavate here. The north wall, as you can see, extended under the porch of the later church, which stands alongside. So he lifted the slabs in the porch and revealed the nave wall underneath. There it had been heavily cut into when the porch was built in the 16th century, if not before. Beyond the porch, the nave wall extended a short distance, but not for its whole original length. We can see it here projecting out beyond the porch, which is up here. This building was originally constructed on a steep slope, so the courses of the wall foundations that remained, because they were laid horizontally, petered out as the ground level rose to the west. At the west end, the foundations had been so close to the surface that over the centuries, people walking over them repeatedly simply wore them away. The last piece of this fragmentary nave wall was clearly unstable, even in Canon Jenkins' day, and he'd underpinned it with cement, which you can see here. Nevertheless, you can see how he shored up the sides of the cutting with bricks, and he also reused gravestones here. Some of these, he was doing this work in the 1860s. Some of the grave slabs were actually dated in the 1820s. They were really quite recent. So that's what we found. At the west end of the nave, we were very fortunate to find a single fragment of west wall still in place. It is just this, and you can see the scale here in centimetres. And this tells us the exact original length of the building. This was cut on 3 sides by graves. So you've got one cut there, we've got another cut there, we've not got another cut here. But that is the original face of the wall. Now let's return to look at the apsidal east end, which you can see here under excavation in 2019. And in particular, let's consider the column bases, which you can see here. So we've got one there, one there. We found a single fragment of column. As you can see here, this gives us the circumference of the whole column when it was complete. This is almost identical to the circumference of these 2 columns that are now in the crypt at Canterbury Cathedral. And they were salvaged from the church at Reculver on the North Kent coast. The church at Reculver was built around 669, so it was only a little later than the time of Ethelburga. And it was demolished around 1809. The engraving shows this appalling vandalism in progress, and this is to see what the arcade at Lyminge probably looked like. You can see one column here still in place. Oops. One column still in place, the other column has been removed. And these are the columns that are now in Canterbury Cathedral. Now you may be wondering what these are. They're not reused Roman columns. They were newly made from Urlithic limestone, a stone that is found no closer than Marquise near Baldwin in France. It may of course have come from a quarry further away, but it does suggest that materials were being imported from the kingdom of the Franks across the Channel. This is an artist's view of the church interior. The painted decorative scheme on the walls was probably much more elaborate than this, but we have no idea what this would have been like. The decoration we have illustrated is copied from manuscripts of around this time, but there would probably have been figurative elements too, as is suggested up here, and possibly embroidered wall hangings. It was probably very colourful. The altar would probably not have been in the extreme east end during Ethelburga's lifetime, and would have been at the east end of the nave, that is this side of the arcade. But later altars tended to move into the east end of the church, which was a space reserved for the clergy. In the excavation we found no remains of the floor, but we imagine that it was made of opus signinum, like the floor of one of the halls on Tain Field. That was probably contemporary with this church. And a church is what this building is most likely to have been. It is built in the characteristic style used for all the tiny number of churches that we know of built in Kent in the 7th century. And there's another similar church of this group in Essex. Fragments of white and red wall plaster give us some insight into the decoration of the walls. The white plaster could have been on the outside as well. We have evidence for window glass. And there's pottery of the 6th or 7th centuries, though nothing was found in a sealed context because all the ground had been disturbed at some time after the church was demolished. The church, of course, had already been dug by Canon Jenkins, but it was also in a burial ground used for around 1,000 years. But we were able to take samples from the distinctive pink mortar you can see here, and this takes its colour from the inclusion of powdered Roman brick, and this makes it extremely hard. The masons who built this church knew their job very well. They were experienced professionals, not people learning how to make stone buildings for the first time. It would seem likely the church was built using skilled masons brought from the Frankish kingdom, like the stone columns. The mortar samples give us a date of the mid to late 7th century. So while we cannot say for certain that the church was built by Queen Ethelburga, the dating shows it certainly could have been. And this fits with what we know of historian Limage. The method of construction shows that the patron of this church was able to mobilise resources from the Frankish kingdom. They were at the forefront of innovation, linking Kent once more to the mainstream of continental culture. This implies a royal involvement because the Kentish royal family was so intimately linked with that of Francia. The archaeology certainly supports what the Kentish royal legend says about Queen Ethelburga in Limage. Now, let's return to look at the aerial view of the apse and consider the walls extending north off the side of the apse here and here off the side of the nave. These walls are cut by the later Norman church, so this structure originally continued under the line of the Norman walls. This is what is known as a porticus. Canon Jenkins thought that this was the location of Ethelburga's tomb, but we think this is unlikely because it's too small a space to have performed this function. It was probably a sacristy for the holy vessels and vestments used in the Mass. But there is good reason to think that we're not too far away from where Ethelburga was actually buried. What we see here is a reimagining of Ethelburga's tomb, created for us in an interactive 3D program by the Centre for the Study of Christianity and Culture at the University of York. And to the left is a description of Ethelburga's tomb, written around 1095 by a monk at Canterbury called Gosselin de Saint-Bertin. And this is perhaps a decade after the last date when we know for sure that the tomb was still standing, though it could have survived longer. We simply don't know. We learn from this passage that by the time it was written, it was thought that the first thing Ethelburga did when she arrived in Limage was to found the first place in England to be called a Christian community, bearing in mind, of course, that this is the perspective from southern England and also the perspective from the 11th century. He goes on to say that as a memorial, this was rather more significant than the one that actually honoured her. In other words, the creation of the first Christian community was a magnificent memorial, while her tomb was not elaborate and on the contrary was quite plain and simple. This tomb, Gosselin says, was placed in a north porticus by the south wall of the church under a vault. But how could a north porticus be by a south wall? This description initially seems rather paradoxical, until you realise that it could describe a porticus on the north side of the 7th century church still standing to the south of the Norman church, which had been built alongside. Canon Jenkins knew this passage. He wrote that this is why he looked for Ethelburga's tomb, and this is how he came to discover the remains of what we now know to be a 7th century church. For him, the porticus that does survive fitted Gosselin's description so well that he did not dwell on its size or pause to consider that it was simply too small to have done the job he assigned to it. But we think it is much more likely, because this porticus is so small, that the burial porticus was therefore further west, adjacent to this one that survives. This would place the burial at least partly under the porch of the Norman church. But sadly, as we've already seen, the surviving masonry there has been badly damaged and could not show if there had been a porticus in this location. Nevertheless, we think Gosselin's description is sufficiently reliable and a reasonable basis for including this second porticus in the reconstruction of the church that was created for us by the Centre for the Study of Christianity and Culture. And this is the burial porticus here, and this is the porticus that we think is a sacristy. You may also note that we reached the conclusion that the most likely material used to roof the church is lead. At the time, there would have been plenty of scrap lead available in the local area from ruined Roman buildings. Lead would probably have been seen as more appropriate for this grand Roman-style building, better than thatch. Lyminge Parish Church even today has a lead roof on the nave, which is quite unusual amongst local churches, most of which are roofed with Kent peg tiles. Who knows, perhaps this lead has been recycled more than once. Returning to historical events, it seems most likely that Ethelburga came to Lyminge in the months after the Battle of Hatfield Chase, where King Edwin was killed in October 633. Lyminge was already a royal residence at this time, with facilities appropriate for royalty. This is why it was a suitable estate for the Dowager Queen. As a Christian, she would have wanted a church where she could pray, and this may have been the one thing she found lacking. So it seems quite likely that her initial effort on arrival was directed at building a suitable space for prayer and services. We know too that stone was considered the most appropriate material for churches. In York, when Edwin was baptised in 627, this was done hurriedly in a wooden building. But work began immediately afterwards on creating the first stone York Minster, because that was considered the proper material for churches. It was a conscious copying of Roman style, and this illustrates how these early Christian kings sought to present themselves as the heirs to Roman tradition. Ethelburga could well have been encouraged in her view of what was appropriate by Bishop Paulinus, her confessor and confidant in the north, who was now Bishop of Rochester in northwest Kent. Had once been a monk in Rome, so well knew how things were done there, and may thus have had a very keenly developed notion of what was proper. But while Ethelburga probably built the church at Lyminge for her own use and that of her Christian household, this is probably as far as it went in her lifetime. The Christian community in Lyminge recorded by Gosselin, as we have seen, would have been her household, the group of aristocratic women who provided companionship to the Queen in her widowhood. It was a later age that portrayed this as a monastery. But during Ethelburga's lifetime, such a concept is entirely anachronistic. It was some decades later that the first monasteries governed by a formal rule, like that of St. Benedict, were founded in southern England, and even these monasteries, as I will show you shortly, were very unlike the monasteries we know from the majestic ruins of the later Middle Ages. Before we move on from Ethelburga's lifetime, we should perhaps pause to consider another suggestive local link between Lyminge and the north of England. This is the church at Paddlesworth, still today a chapel of Lyminge that is dedicated to St. Oswald. It lies about 2.5 miles from Lyminge on high ground towards the coast. It's reached by Tedderslee's Road, a name that could mean Tatter's clearing or Tatter's open space. It is Bede who notes that Ethelburga was also known as Tatter. The church building we see today, the one in the picture, dates to after the Norman conquest, but the dedication is very unusual. It's the only pre-conquest dedication to St. Oswald in southern England, and as many of you will know, St. Oswald was king of Northumbria after Edwin. In fact, after Oswald was killed by the same King Penda of Mercia who killed Edwin, Oswald's brother Oswiu became king, and he married Ethelburga's daughter, Eanflad. It is not inconceivable that Eanflad was living at Lyminge with her mother before she travelled north to marry Oswiu. The foundation of a church dedicated to her future husband's martyred brother, who was already by this stage proclaimed a saint, would be quite appropriate at such a time. Such a foundation, however, is not proved. Nobody has excavated an early church here. I simply leave this thought with you, but the dedication is suggestive, is it not? Whether the community at Lyminge comprised of her household outlasted Ethelburga herself is difficult to say. She is said to have been buried in the church she built probably around 650, though we have no precise date. Her date of death is often quoted as 647, but I found no provenance for this date earlier than 1608 in a Jesuit martyrology. I'm still looking, but at the moment I'm inclined to think this date is not reliable and no more authentic than either of the two feast days attributed to Ethelburga, 5th of April and 8th of September. The archaeology shows there was occupation south and west of the church by the end of the 7th century, and this aligns with a charter of this date recording the grant of land to support the church at Lyminge. This might imply a monastic community. It is conceivable that Ethelburga was venerated locally as a holy woman from the time of her death. Though whether there was continuity from 650 or whether there was a new foundation in the years around 700 is difficult to say. But either way, it appears that by the early 700s there was a community at Lyminge based around the church that contained Ethelburga's mortuary chapel, and this was treated as a local shrine. This illustration shows what the monastic community may have looked like about a century after Ethelburga's time. The only stone building was the church. This large barn in the foreground was used for threshing grain and has been excavated. The monastery served as an economic centre for the local area. We seem to have largely agricultural activity in this part of the site in the foreground, and there is metal working down the slope. The path illustrated follows the line of a bridleway that can still be walked today. The royal monasteries of the 8th and 9th centuries were powerhouses of prayer, usually run by royal abbesses. Their role, through prayer, was to defend the interests of the kingdom in the spiritual realm against the forces of evil, just as men defended the kingdom on the battlefield. But they were also important centres of agricultural and industrial production, and of course produced manuscripts. They could be centres of pilgrimage too, and by 804 we know that Lyminge was the site not only of the grave of Queen Ethelburga, but also of St. Eadburh, whose relics were brought from Minster in Thanet in the northeast of Kent. The dedication of the church is properly to St Mary and St Edburg, but this was changed to St Mary and St Ethelburga at the end of the 19th century. The 9th century was a difficult time in England with the beginning of Danish Viking raids. A refuge in Canterbury was granted to the community at Lyminge, but Lyminge itself does not seem to have been abandoned at this time. This coin shows that there was someone present in Lyminge and in a position to lose a coin of some value in the second half of the 9th century. We have no evidence for destruction of buildings at this time. By 1000, Lyminge seems to have come into the possession of the Archbishops of Canterbury, who held it for the next 500 years. New building at this time suggests that Lyminge went through a revival, and this may be associated with a new hagiography created in Canterbury to celebrate the life of St Edburg. The first printed edition of this life was only published in 2019, but this allows us to see how miracles, some set in Lyminge, were described apparently in a bid to promote Edburg's cult and the number of pilgrims. The new structures built in the early 11th century west of the church may have been part of this promotion. What we do know is that any flourishing of Lyminge as a pilgrimage centre did not long survive the Norman conquest. Archbishop Lanfranc, the new Norman archbishop, stripped Lyminge of its relics and gave them to his new foundation in Canterbury, dedicated appropriately enough to St Gregory, the Pope who had initiated St Augustine's mission 500 years before. So this is the last known resting place for Queen Ethelburga. Lanfranc's foundation dedicated to St Gregory in Canterbury. Her relics were probably placed in one of these side chapels. So we've got one here, and you can see they're illustrated here in the reconstruction. So this was after they were taken from Lyminge in 1085. This part of St Gregory's Priory was excavated during redevelopment work in Canterbury in 1988-91. The original building was burnt down in a fire in 1145 and later rebuilt on a different site. No evidence for any burials was found, but that is not surprising, as any relics would have been elevated above ground in a shrine. And then, when the priory was dissolved in 1537, the relics passed from history. We have very little evidence for any relics being destroyed during the dissolution of the monasteries, not even, I may say, those of Thomas Becket, despite what is sometimes said. So it seems most likely that on the orders of Henry VIII's commissioners, the shrines were dismantled, anything valuable was appropriated for the king, and any bones, if they still survived, were buried quietly nearby. All the evidence we do have is that saints' relics were treated respectfully as human remains, but they were quickly and secretly buried so they could no longer be venerated. Back in Lyminge, the graves of Ethelburga and Edburg had been emptied in 1085. The new Norman church was built around the same time. It seems that the old church standing alongside, by this stage over 400 years old, was demolished as surplus to requirements. At some point, the walls of the old church were thoroughly demolished and removed to below floor level. We now have only fragmentary foundations surviving. But when did this happen? The masonry of the old church does not seem to be reused systematically in the Norman church. There are, it is true, a few Roman bricks incorporated into the Norman masonry, but they are not necessarily recycled from the 7th century church, and a single piece of 7th century mortar may be a later patch and not part of the original Norman construction. We suspect that the two churches stood side by side for a period, and demolition of Ethelburga's church occurred later, probably early in the 12th century. 100 years after this, all memory of the old church seems to have been lost, because grave diggers used the site to bury the dead and did not know what was there. They clearly did not know what was beneath the ground because they cut through the foundations, leaving gouges like the one you can see here by the feet of the skeletons. Why on earth did they not move the grave a few inches further west and save the effort of cutting through the stonework is hard to say. It would have been so much easier. During the excavation, we only explored graves at the east end of the church, which all intercut one another. They were really packed in quite close. So it was possible to work out a relative sequence. A pottery sherd found in the earliest burial dated to the early 13th century, showing when burials started in this area. Miraculously, Canon Jenkins had left these burials undisturbed, as he seems to have been only interested in uncovering the walls. So without knowing it, he'd left us this vital piece of dating evidence. I should add that all the human bones we discovered were subsequently reburied. Our rector led a service of reburial with appropriate words taken from early medieval liturgy, and there is actually now a stone laid over this with an inscription saying what's buried underneath. Now this almost brings us to the end of the story of the church in Lyminge, but there is one more thing to address, and that is Canon Jenkins' conjectures about a grand three-aisle basilica. You will remember this plan that he published. So we have imagination, and now we have reality. This is what we actually found. The 7th century church is quite small. Here's the tiny fragment of west wall that you may remember we looked at. The walls over here, to the west of the church, belong to the building work of the early 11th century that we also saw earlier. The structures possibly associated with the promotion of St. Ethelburga's cult. These two sections of masonry were built some 350 years apart, and as you can see, they're not actually aligned. Canon Jenkins has straightened up the lines to align them because he thought they were part of a single grand structure. But they weren't. We found no evidence for any other walls. The robbed out foundations identified by the canon were simply not visible to us. So there we are. We've resolved what Canon Jenkins actually found, and it's true, this was a fabulously interesting and rare 7th century church, but a church in the style of other church period, not the grand basilica of his imagination. But whatever else we think about him, we do have to be thankful that he went to look for Ethelburga's tomb, because had we not known, as a result of Jenkins' work, that there actually was something there, nobody would have gone to the trouble and expense of lifting the path to explore just on spec. In conclusion, I will just take you through a few of the things we did to make this a suitably broad-ranging project sufficient to attract lottery fund money. Here you can see how we've laid a new path, and the outline of the 7th century church is marked out. The new path throughout the churchyard actually cost half the £300,000 we spent on the whole project. This is our excavation report, published as an archaeologian monograph by the Society of Antiquaries in London, and freely available for download. We used local craftsmen to make this display unit in oak, so it suited the interior of our ancient church, and also provided some useful additional storage. This contains a display of some of the artefacts from the excavation. Here's the column fragment, as it happens. On the left here, you can see a monitor, and this gives access to the interactive program I've already mentioned, created for us by the Centre for the Study of Christianity and Culture in York. There's a 3D reconstruction of the interior of the 7th century church that you can navigate around, and you can drill down to find additional information. There's also a sequence of images showing how the Norman church has evolved over the past 1,000 years. Around the village, where previously we had nothing for visitors to see, we've created a heritage trail with information panels that provide details about what has been found and the history of Lyminge. The main access to the church on the south side, through the porch, is down a flight of steps, and we wanted to create new access for those with reduced mobility. So we laid a new path to the north door where there was no path previously, and a new ramp provides a level access over the low threshold. We also planted a swathe of daffodils to enhance the churchyard. We commissioned new artworks from local artists to celebrate the themes of the project, and these remain on display in and around the church. And finally, we ended the project with a festival, complete with Ostkentingas, a local reenactment group, and our own specially brewed festival ale, Queen Ethelburga's ale. It was actually very good. So last but by no means least, I should mention all our sponsors who provided much of the funding we needed. But our thanks go particularly to the many individuals who gave both money and many thousands of hours of time and who made it possible for us to rediscover Queen Ethelburga's church at Lyminge. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you for your time. I hope you found it interesting. And as David said at the beginning, I am happy to take questions. So I'll hand it back to you, David.
Thank you very much indeed, Rob. Well, I enjoyed that enormously. You'll appreciate that I had the advantage over some of the other members of the YPS that having visited, having read some of the materials that you've written yourself, Rob, and talking to my sister, I knew some of that already, but you've really brought it to life and added great clarity to my understanding of timelines, links, how it fits together with the wider period that we're talking about. And I found it absolutely fascinating. So thank you very much indeed, Rob. I really appreciate it. We did have one question in the chat, which someone has already answered. So, but I'm going to give it to you anyway, Rob. What's the origin of the name Lyminge?
Well, so there is a place about 4 miles away from Lyminge on the coast, on the south coast, called Lym. And that derives from a name that was in use in the Roman period that we know, but is probably earlier than the Roman period. So the Romans built at Lym a fort that they called Portus Limanis. Limanis derives from the name of the river, which we now know as the East Rother, but then was known as the Leman, and it reached the coast at Lym. So what we seem to have, so Lyminge itself means the central place of the Leman folk. And the people who lived at Lyminge actually called themselves the Lemanwara. So what we seem to have is a group of people who identified originally with the area around Lym, who then migrated to Lyminge, and we know that they migrated here at the end of the 5th century. So these were people who were in Lym earlier than that. And they made this their central sort of political centre. So we've got this small area which subsequently was incorporated into the Kingdom of Kent. But you find this all over Lyminge and all over Kent. And this is probably why you've got a royal estate based in Lyminge. So my guess, but we don't know this, is that what you may have are Germanic mercenaries who were employed by the local aristocracy in Kent, who actually were initially based at the Roman fort at Lym. That fort we know fell down. The geology is very unstable. The whole fort slid down the cliff. So there would have been a good reason why anybody who was stationed there would have moved from Lym. And Lyminge was actually unoccupied. So far as we know, there was no occupation in Lyminge throughout the whole Roman period. So it was land that was empty, waiting to be occupied. So if you were looking for a home, if your fort had actually collapsed, Lyminge was a very good place to come. So that's probably why they migrated inland. It's only a few miles. So that's it. It's the central place of the Leman folk. But also demonstrating these are people, although they're Germanic in origin, and they were burying them. You've got Scandinavian style brooches coming out of these early graves, so they're definitely continental in origin. They're adopting a name in Britain, so they're not bringing an identity with them. They're actually taking a name once they've arrived, and I think that's probably quite significant. Just as Kent itself doesn't get renamed. You know, the name of Kent continues right from before the Roman period, and carries on. And of course, it's still called Kent today. So that identity has persisted.
Thank you very much. Yes. Patricia, who gave an answer in the chat, has also suggested that the GE at the end is an Anglian word meaning district. So it kind of
Yes.
links with the river and the district idea.
Yes, indeed.
Ian and Shirley have asked, what's the size of the brooch that you showed earlier that was on your very opening slide?
So it's probably about 3 inches across, something like that.
It's certainly very fine work, isn't it? We tend to think about that period as lacking in civilization compared with what went before and what went after, but that's chiefly because we have relatively few of this kind of find, and we know less about this period of our history, but the craftsmanship that went into those brooches was absolutely amazing.
Yes, and actually, in many respects, it's superior when you look at this stuff. You know what's coming out of Sutton Hoo. If anyone on the call is familiar with the Staffordshire hoard, the quality of this metalwork is actually superior to that coming out of Francia at the time. I mean, the Franks actually wanted to get hold of this jewelry because it was so finely made. And if you see the amount of detail that goes into it, I mean, it's quite incredible. Craftsmen today struggle to reproduce this stuff. So it is very fine work indeed. And equally true, actually, it's not just about metalwork. If you look at the manuscripts, England was known for the quality of its manuscripts. You had a lot of gold work on purple vellum. These became really prized and very, very high quality manuscripts produced in places like Canterbury. We think at Minster and Thanet. So yes, very high work indeed, and embroideries as well. I mean, you've got Opus Anglicanum. It's actually called English work, highly prized. You can find Opus Anglicanum in the treasury in Vienna. I mean, it was taken by the Holy Roman Emperors because it was of such high quality. So yes, I mean, we're not a backwater at all, and it wasn't a dark age.
No, indeed. Now, can I just encourage anyone else who's on the call, if you've got any further questions, could you perhaps either unmute yourself and ask, or put a question in the group chat?